In this video, you'll get an exclusive sneak peek into how I like to use GTO Wizard to improve my poker game. Combining both the study tool and the trainer mode, I'm going to share some insights from my own game and show how I look to improve. Hope you enjoy. So, starting off, I always like to approach a study session with something specific I want to look at. So what I want to look at today is going to be heads up small blind limped pots at around 16 big blinds deep with a turn barrel. The reason being, this is one of the most common situations in regular speed spin and goes, so it makes the most sense to spend the majority of study time on the most common spots. So we'll have the small blind call and the big blind checks back. This is what we expect in Fairyland, and we always have to be aware that when we are playing in reality, people may deviate from this a little bit, but it's always going to be a very good approximation as a starting point. So, what flop should we start with? Well, I think we can categorize flops into quite a few different ones. Firstly, I'm going to start with ace high, and I'm going to go for two high card ones. So this is going to be an ace with another Broadway card. The other Broadway card isn't super significant. I will put it as a jack, and we can have any other random card. I'm just interested in high ace ones to begin with. So we're going to take ace jack 7. No donking, this makes sense, and we're going to have the small blind betting. What do we notice about the small blind's bet frequency? Well, it's super high, and we can compare this to, do I think this is happening in game? I would say yes, very often we face a bet when we're playing versus a regular player. Sometimes they may even just bet 100%. So the solver GTO Wizard here is going to be more than applicable for our studying process. And now there's going to be quite a few different turns. How would I categorize them? Well, I would say we're going to have some non-completed ones where the draws don't complete. We're going to have completed ones, so like 9 of diamonds, 10 of diamonds, even just a 10 in general, where straights or flushes complete. And we're going to have paired, so I'd categorize it into those 3 main turns. What I'd like to do is check non-completed first, so it doesn't matter specifically which I pick. Let's go for the 5 of clubs. Before I click it in, I'd like to ask myself a few questions. How aggressive do I think small blind's going to be barreling? Well, my assumption would be when we bet the flop, the big blind calls, we're still left with all of our trash hands, whereas the big blind's folded the majority of its very weak hands on the flop, therefore the ranges are going to start to equal out a bit more. So I wouldn't expect small blind to actually barrel super aggressively, probably under half of the time. So let's check. No donk makes sense, and we see the small blind is barreling 40% of the time roughly. And it's going for a large size, so my initial thought process is spot on here. What I would do is confirm my thought process here, so I would look at my favourite tab being the ranges one, and I'd go straight to the graph and see what's happening. We see that the small blind has the nut advantage. This makes sense. It's just going to have some hands the big blind can't have, for example ace jack and some sets, because the big blind isolates pre-flop. The big blind can't have these holdings. However, if we look at the bottom part of the graph here, the small blind now actually has a considerable amount of just the worst hands that the big blind doesn't have. Why is this? Well, the big blind's already called a flop C bet, so it's folded all of its worst hands. Because the small blind was betting so often on the flop, it's going to have bet a lot of trash. So we see at the bottom here, lots of hands like 9-4 offsuit in the small blind's range, which the big blind's just never going to have. So then I like to go up to the equity buckets, and I like to see here, and we see it's confirmed, right? The big blind has basically no turtle trash. In fact, we can find what the worst and the big blind has in theory here by going here, and we see it's 10-3 with the 10 of diamonds. So this is kind of turtle trash, but it's still actually ahead of a decent chunk of the small blind's holdings, right? It's ahead of these 9-4 offsuit type hands. And we don't have to go far into the big blind's range on the graph here if we just go to worst 25% of hands, and we're already at king high. So we're already seeing that there's not turtle trash in the big blind's range. This means that there's going to be lots of hands in the medium and slightly higher equity buckets here. We look what's the most common equity buckets for the big blind, so the numbers on the left. Well, none in the total trash. Quite a few in 25 to 50, so this is going to be those king high type of holdings a lot. If we see here, look, king high, queen high, lots of king and queen high mainlys. And is a 5 in this bracket? No, not quite. So a 5 is having more than 50% equity. We go 50 to 60%. We now start to see some 5x are making it in there. And then the largest two equity buckets, if we combine them, is actually all the pairs. So this is the 7x and the jack x from the flop, which we obviously expect the big blind to defend all of them against. And this is explaining why theory does not like to barrel that often here in small blind shoes. It's recognising that, hey, I've got so many trash combinations in my range now, I can't just always bet. I've already narrowed down the big blind's range. So it's not really looking to go for medium sizings because it doesn't have many hands. It wants to bet for a medium size. A hand that might make some sense would maybe be a hand like a weak jack, targeting to get some value from a 7x or protect from these king queen high combinations, but that's not enough of the range for the small blind to want to construct a strategy around. It wants to construct a strategy around its best value. So what's its best value on this board? Well, it's a lot of these ace high combinations, right? So these pair of aces, sorry, they have very, very high equity. If I swap over to the equity tab here, we see what's the worst ace we can have. It would be ace 2, right? Even ace 2 has 86% of equity. So it's very, very, very ahead of the big blind's range. So it's going to feel very comfortable to start putting a lot of chips into the pot. As we can see, the preferred size in here is an overbet. It's either a small overbet or even 1.5 times a pot. And this is just because we have a lot of hands that are very, very clearly ahead of the big blind's range. And the big blind has many hands that feel comfortable to defend versus a bet that just wouldn't face any pressure with, say, a half pot bet. It's going to be super easy to continue every 7 and jack x versus a half pot bet, right? However, if we go to strategy plus EV and we choose the most common sizing, so 4.5 big blinds, what part of a range are we starting to put in a tough spot? Well, we can go to the filters here and see. If we go to low pair and third pair, we're already starting to put these hands in a very tough spot versus such a sizing. This is because versus our value betting range, so the top pairs of aces and some best jacks, they're very, very far behind. They're going to have limited redraw outs to simply just trips and 2 pair. And sometimes they're actually going to be drawing dead if they're already facing, say, a 2 pair type hand. So by going so large, we start to force them to invest a lot of chips in a spot they're often going to be ahead or behind, which is what we want to do. This starts to generate some fold equity for our bluffs as well. If we go back to our strategy plus EV and clear the filters, and we're going to take a look at what kind of hands do we want to bluff. Well, firstly we can check king high. It just doesn't want to bluff king high. This might seem like not important, but it actually does have some importance here. Why does it not want to bluff king high? Well, if we go to bet 4.5 and we see what does big blind fold, well, it's actually got about 18% of its range king high, and almost all of it is folding. Look, 82% of king high is folding. So we don't really want to be bluffing with king high ourselves when this is going to be one of the first parts of the range we generate easy folds from. See, king high and then queen high are going to be our main folds to start with, as well as some of the weak gut shots. So we'd rather not have these hands if possible. So we see queen high is also folding a decent amount. Does this mean we don't want to bluff queen high as well? So we could go back and check this, and we see no, actually it's reasonably happy to bluff some queen high. If we go to no made hand here, it's bluffing the worst queen highs. Okay, why does it want to take the low queen highs and not the top queen highs? Well, when we bluff with our low queen highs, what do we achieve? We fold out the villain from better queen highs he could call the flop with, and we fold him out from king highs. So we're folding directly better high cards, and when we take a hand like queen to off and we bet big, because we're folding out him from all of these better queen highs, we're clearing the queen as an out. What do I mean by this? I mean, when we bet big on the turn and receive a call, we can say it's very unlikely the big blind has a lot of queen X himself, and therefore when we hit the queen, we're going to feel comfortable to go for value on the river, and that's quite a key point. And then it's just going to take some of its very worst hands here, like some 10 high, 9 high, 8 high, etc. But noticeably, it doesn't really take these really low hands. Why could this be? Well, hands like 4-3 have a direct gut shot. Same with some of these 6 draws, and quite often in position, when it's using a large size, it will, on a board where straights and flushes aren't completed, it's going to prefer to use polarizing bluffs. It doesn't want to face a raise and get blasted off any draw equity that it couldn't call a raise with, but also it's going to consider that it's going to have to give up with quite a lot of pure air on the turn, which is going to leave the range susceptible to river probes. So to help defend a bit against this, if we check draws on the turn quite often, we're now just going to have more hands that can improve on the river and defend versus that river aggression via probe bets. So that's something to consider on these relatively blank turns. We don't want to just barrel off with all of our draws and check all of our hands with no draw equity, because then we're going to be super weak on the river and end up folding 75-80% of the time to river probe bets. We want to check a lot of our hands with draw equity so we can improve to better hands on the river, and we want to mix with our really weak holdings so our check range doesn't become too susceptible, and also just so the big blind can't always fold to the barrel with when we have value, right? Okay, so that's a blank turn. What about a more completed turn? Let's take the extreme example and let's go for something like the 9 of diamonds, right? Probably the most extreme example we can choose. Again, I like to pause at this point and I like to ask myself, what do I expect the solver to do? I don't like to look at what the solver does. First, I like to try and think for myself to see if I'm thinking on the right page. So on the 9 of diamonds, I think this is going to improve the big blind's range significantly. It'll defend flush draws and all the gut shots. I think this could potentially lead to a decent amount of donking on the turn, which I don't think most players in games are going to find. So let's see if that's accurate. And it seems like, if I get rid of no made hand here, we have 18% of donking. That's definitely somewhat significant, right? It's definitely not 0%. And we see there's actually some hands that donk at a very high frequency. What's the most donked hand we can see? It looks like 10-8, right? This is a straight. And a straight makes up a decent amount of combinations. If we know that in real games, for example, the person we're playing against just checks his range on the turn, which is a pretty common strategy in spin and goes, then we need to be a little bit more careful, because he's going to have these strong hands that in the solver here are donking at a decent frequency. So let's check how the small blind reacts when the big blind checks. I expect it to not want to overbet anymore. I think big blind's going to have too many really strong hands that it's going to have to decrease its barrel sizing. So we can check this. And we see this is the case, look. It's now using 3/4 pot as its main sizing. And what do we notice? It's now checking 65% of the time. So it's decreased the barrel frequency a little bit and also decreased the sizing. And this is already taken into account that the big blind was supposed to donk 20%. If the big blind wasn't finding these donks, this check number would actually go up, because the big blind would still have all of his best hands, and in position, theory would just not want to invest more into this pot. So let's go to the ranges tab again, like I like to use, and let's see what's going on. We see the big blind has spiked ahead at the top part of the graph now. He's got the nut advantage. We see this in the 90 to 100% equity bucket too. We see the big blind just has a lot of flushes. This makes sense, right? He'll defend them all on the flop, all the flush draws, and the small blind will have a decent chunk of flushes as well, but not as much, because the small blind's range is wider. Because the small blind bet 90% on the flop, it's got many more combos in total, whereas because the big blind got to fold a lot on the flop versus the bet, flushes now make up more of a percentage of its entire range. So this is why the big blind has the nut advantage here. We can see if we look at the total combos, Small blind has 717 combos of all hands here. The big blind only has 256. This is exactly what I mean by because the small blind bet so wide on the flop and the big blind got to fold a lot, the flushes just make up a larger portion because there's less combos to begin with. If we go to really, really low equity hands, the big blind just has absolutely no trash anymore, we can see on the graph. This is because when turns complete like this, so many hands picked up at least some equity. What might have been a really weak defend on the flop for the big blind, something like a hand with just the 10 of diamonds in, right? That's gone from having 10 high to now having a combo draw on the turn, and this shifts the average equity of the hands up in the big blinds a lot. It also makes it harder for the small blind to have hands it feels comfortable going value for. So, if we go to equity here, and what would be a really strong value hand from the flop from the small blind? I don't know, something like a pair of aces, right? Let's take our ace 2, which had 86% of equity when it was a blank 5 turn, right? And let's look for the combo that doesn't have a diamond so we can take a suited one. Ace 2 of spades. It's now dropped to 71.7. That's 15% less equity than the other turn. That's very significant. And don't forget, that's if the big blind has these donks. If we want to check what the hand actually has versus the entire range, we can move back up here and go back to big blind's action. We can go to ranges, and we can now look at ace 2 suited's equity, and we see it has 69% versus a player that didn't donk anything on the turn. So you can see how this supposed turn donking from the big blind is actually a donk that contains relative strength, because when a player misses it, it's pushing the equity of the small blind's hands down. Okay, so that's always something I like to check. What is the implication if they miss these donks? Well, our implication would be we just have to bet much tighter for value. Okay, so if we go back to the strategy it's playing here, we see it's a small bet. And what's the threshold for this bet for value? Well, are top pairs happy to always go for it like before? We see the answer's actually quite clearly no. If we take a look at the aces without diamonds, they're actually doing a lot more checking here, look, than betting. Only when we have a higher kicker or at least some kind of draw equity is it preferring to bet. You see on the offsuit combinations, it's much preferring to bet when it has a flush draw. If you look at the very low combos, for example, when it's got the diamond, it's basically always betting, right? When it's not got the diamond, it's basically always checking. So on a turn that improves big blind's equity, small blind simply has to barrel with more equity. So it looks like my assumptions were quite correct there, and I'm happy with that. What about bluffs? Do we still want to barrel with a more polarized barrel range, or do we prioritize take and draw equity this time? Well, we can check this, right? We can again clear this filter, and we can take a look at the hands which barrel. So let's take a look at no made hands and king highs which barrel. Do we notice any patterns? Let's take a look. Queen 8. Okay, it looks like it's taken the combination when it has the diamond. Is this the same with all the queen highs? It looks like yes. What about 10 highs? These can have gut shots, right? Or a flush draw. So actually it's preferring to take the weaker ones here. We see it's not really taking the 10 of diamond as often as it's taken without the 10 of diamonds, right? It would rather use a 2 of diamonds. And this is again because it anticipates it's going to face some turn check raises. It doesn't want to take a hand that has decent equity but can't call a raise. It would much prefer to take a hand which still has equity when called but is less bothered about folding. You think, what if we bet and the big blind raises, what are the most likely hands we expect the big blind to raise? Well, it's most likely to be a hand like at least 2 pair, right? Or a straight or a flush. We can confirm this. So if we have the small blind to bet 3, and we see the big blind is having a little bit of raising going on. If we remove these filters, okay, you see this is what? Nearly 10% of raising. And what hand categories for value is it raising? Well, it's mainly raising 2 pair plus, right? If we filter, we can even do this, look, and see what it's raising. What are the main raise combinations? Well, we have 2 pair with a flush draw here, right? We have straights. We have pair plus combo draw. So it's taking very, very high equity hands. When somebody has a hand like 10-8 with a diamond and raises, or let's say 9-7 of diamond and raises, is it a disaster to bet fold? So if we go back to the small blind, please. Is it a disaster to bet fold something like 10-2 off with the 10 of diamonds or 10-2 with no diamond? It's not, right, because we're basically dead against anything he raises. We've just got 0% equity. However, is it bad to bet fold something like a hand with a 10 of diamonds? Well, yes, because you think if we have the 10 of diamonds, it's more likely he's got a hand like this 9-7. And versus that hand, we actually have outs to outdraw it, right? We can hit a diamond, we can hit our gut shot. So we're being forced off equity. So it'd rather construct its range in a way where it can use draws that don't have much equity versus the raising range and can comfortably fold. And it doesn't want to use draws that still have decent equity but can't call a re-raise. For example, what could be our best combo draw? It would be something like King-Queen, right, with a Queen of Diamonds. Something around this kind of hand, or King-10 with a King of Diamonds. And you can see it's not taking it, because if we bet and face, for example, a jam, it's just not going to have the odds to call. So it'd rather check in position, and it achieves 2 things. It makes sure it can realise its equity, and it also, again, protects that river range. By barreling our weaker draws and checking some of our better draws, we're making sure that our river range is more protected versus probe bets, and that we can still have good, strong hands on the river in our range. Okay, so let's check the other type of turn we could have, which could be a paired turn. When the top card pairs, it's usually still going to be very advantageous for the small blind, so we won't check this one. We're going to check the Jack and the 7. Either one of them. Let's check the 7. We'll go for the 7 not completing the flush draw. What do I expect to happen here? Well, I expect there'll be some leading. The big blind will now have a bit of an advantage in the 7x region, although not as much as on some other boards. Because the small blind does a lot of flop C betting, he's still going to maintain a lot of 7x's on the turn, so I don't think donking will be as extreme as it is on some boards. So let's check. Go over the big blind strategy, and we have a 25% donk. This is fine, but we notice it's a very, very, very polarizing donk here. It is an overbet or check. Quite often in some donk scenarios, you're going to have a lot of block donking. And I'll show you one after this. Check my thought process is right. I believe it's using a large size in here because we just don't have much air in the big blind's range after check calling the flop. And we just don't have many hands that are interested in gathering protection here, right? If we've got a jack, we don't really need to donk to get protection. If we've got a non-paired hand, there's nothing to really protect. So when we're donking here, we're saying, hey, I've got a really strong hand, I want to put chips into the pot, or I've got a bluff. And you see that's very congruent with the strategy. We see what's actually donking. It's literally just trips and bluffs pretty much, right? There's not like Jack X in here, there's not even an Ace X in here, because they just don't gather much from donking, whereas the 7 wants to make sure the small blind can't check back. For example, all of its strong hands and bluffs. And bluffs just want to leverage the fact that the small blind bet everything on the flop, so he's going to have to fold a bit if we lead out, and this allows some of our weaker hands to realise its equity. So we see here the really weak flush draws, for example, quite like a donk bet. And if we check what other non-made hands kind of like it, well, it really loves it with these gut shot hands, which are going to have a hard time to defend versus a barrel. So it's trying to get equity realization here, as well as equity denial from the small blind. So, theory should be donking 25% here, okay. What should the small blind be doing after those donks? Well, now the small blind feels relatively comfortable to sometimes barrel with some of its best ace-x. We see here it's not always checking them back. It's still happy to go for some value with some ace-x. We see as well, with queens and kings, it's happy to sometimes go for it. And even with some second pair, it's happy to get a little bit of value. But we see the sizing is small. This is because the big blind just doesn't have Many hands that, if we go really big, are put in a tough decision. It's going to have plenty of Jack X, and it's going to have 7x that can easily call versus a big bet. And it's going to have lots of trash that could easily fold to a big bet. When we bet small, we're really putting these king, these queen, these 10 highs in a tough spot. We can see here we bet 1.5, and he's got horrible decisions with all of these queen high, trash king high combinations. If we was to bet really big here, we just make his life easy, right? He can just fold all these hands. When we bet small, we're really putting him to the test. And always good to think about what's going to happen in our real life games. If we're against a reg we don't think is capable to donk on these 7x turns, our check could even go close to 100%. Why is this? Well, he's going to be left with a range that just has too many 7x's in that we don't want to pay. If he's never donking his 7x's, he's just going to be way stronger than he should be on this turn. To demonstrate for you a different kind of board now, where I think donking would be more prevalent with a small sizing, I'm going to try and think of one randomly in my head. So let's go for a board that's going to have way less c-bet. Let's go for a 10-3-4. In a limp pot, I expect this to have c-bet nowhere near 90%. We're probably looking at less than 50%, around like a 45% c-bet maybe would be my guess. So let's firstly check this. We'll go to the flop, and we'll see how often the small blind does bet. Checks 55% of the time, so this means 45% c-bet, so I'm pretty accurate with that. Okay, so we have bet call, and now let's say the 4 pairs. This is where I'd expect it to donk quite often with a more small sizing, because now there's going to be a benefit to the donk, right? The 3's going to want to gather protection. So let's check. We can put any 4. We'll choose a blank 4 with no flush draw again. And we'll see how much donking is going on. When it loads, we see 18% donking this time, but now it's not using an overbet. It has actually decreased to 3/4, but actually it's not wanting to donk the 3 here. So I was off with my assumption. Okay, so am I missing something in my thought process? Whenever I check something and I didn't get the exact result I thought I was going to see, I think it's always good to see if I can find out why. So does a flush draw being present change this? Usually it doesn't have the biggest impact, but it could maybe have some, so let's check that. We see not really, right? Is it because we chose a board where the c-bet is a lot lower for the small blind, so we had 45% c-bet on this board, right? How about we choose a board that has the same 4 and 3, but we expect to be c-bet at a bigger rate? So if we change this 10-4-3 and we go for an ace 4-3, okay, and we check how often does a small blind c-bet, I expect it to be a lot more now. We see, yep, nearly range, right, 95%. We have the same scenario here, and let's put a blank 4 to pair again, and now let's see what the donk is on such a turn here. Now the donk is 9%, but we see it is starting to donk some 3x. So I guess this is because the ranges are a bit wider now, so 3x makes a bit more sense to donk. But anyway, you see the sizing has decreased massively, because now the donk isn't so much saying, hey, I've got more nuts, and it's not trying to leverage this. It's trying to say, hey, I need more protection, right? And it's using a range that's shifted quite a bit. So we're going to take our 10-4-3 board I put in, and we're just going to take a look at the barrel opportunities on this board, and then we're going to drill a little bit in the trainer. So we're going to have our c-bet opportunity of a call, and we're going to have turns. On this board, I think there's going to be turns which complete the gut shots from the flop, and then there's going to be high card turns and paired turns. Paired turns usually play pretty similar, and we've looked at the donk, so we're going to take a look at the straight completed ones first. So let's pick the 5. Will there be donking? We see yes, there is donking. Again, often the case when the turn improves a significant portion of the big blind's range, there'll be donking. Here's the case, right? A lot of hands have now picked up some equity. Okay, and again, usually when there's donking going on, it's going to make our check back range a little bit weaker to incentivize the small blind to bet a little bit more. So on this turn, I'd expect it to barrel reasonable, but not huge. I'd expect about a 3/4 sizing, the pot at most. And this is correct, like 3/4 and a small bet being the main sizings. This is just because the turn has improved the big blind somewhat. The big blind is going to have all the two pairs that have opened up, 10-5, 5-4, 5-3. It's also going to have all the hands like 6-2, 6-7, so really good hands which do devalue a little bit our flop value bets, right? If we bet the flop for value with ace-10, it's lost some value on this turn because straights and all the two pairs are present for the big blind. So we're not going to feel comfortable going for as many bets. So we see a check of 50% here. And we see if we check the equity of ace-10. I always like to check the equity of my value. So we check ace-10 off. It's got 75.7%. Okay. Now I would ask myself, what if it was a blank turn? What's the difference? So this has a gut shot actually. So I'm going to take, instead of ace-10, I'll take king-10 because it doesn't have the gut shot. Okay. 73.8. So similar anyway. We can stick with king-10. And instead of this being a 5, let's have it being a more random blank turn, let's say a 9. What do we notice about our king 10's equity? It's a lot higher now, right? It's 82.8%. And what do we notice about our strategy? Our sizing's gone up and our betting frequency has gone up a little bit. So when the turn doesn't bring the big blind as many new hand categories that have effectively outdrawn our flop value, is when we're going to feel more comfortable to barrel a bigger bet sizing on the turn. We see this nice and clearly when I change the turn from a 5 to a 9, right? The bet sizing goes up. It's just because the equity of our value hands has gone up. Okay, so we know that we need to decrease the sizing with our value. What about our bluffs? What should change? Well, what bluffs are we going to use on a random high blank turn? Something that comes to my head without looking would be, I think it would make sense to bet hands that can potentially outdraw the 10, that don't have too much equity. So a hand like Jack 5 off or Queen 5 off seem like pretty nice bluffs off the top of my head. Maybe sometimes can represent a straight when that fills in on the river. Or at least having 2 overs to the 4 and 3, which I guess is going to be nearly every hand, right? But having an over to the 10 does seem like quite a nice thing if possible. So let's check our bluffs. If we go to our no-made hands here, which hands is it looking to prioritise? Well, it seems to really like taking these queen high ones, right? And these jack 5, jack 6, it's taken in full. And this is just because, like I say, it can outdraw the flop top pair. And if it faces a raise, it doesn't care. And what do we notice again? We notice that our draws are mainly checking, right? 6-5, checking. 7-6, gut shot. I guess actually it's a double gut shot here. Checking. Jack 7 for the new turn, gut shot. Checking mainly. Jack 8, checking. Again, by barreling more polarized, we're protecting our river range versus probes, again. And we're also making the option of check raising for the big blind a bit less attractive. You think if you always just barreled good hands, so your value and draw equity, when the big blind say turns 2 pair, if the big blind slow played a flop top pair, he would be super incentivized to just jam versus your barrel and force all of your draw equity off the hand, right? But when he's facing a more polarized barrel, so we've got all these queen 5s in, it's much harder for him to now just want to raise versus our bet, because he's just not going to force us off equity, right? He's just going to pay our value and he's just going to fold us off relatively low equity hands. Okay, so I think we've noticed a clear pattern from this study session. We've noticed that if the turn doesn't really improve the defender's range from the flop much, we feel very comfortable to go for large barrel sizings. If the turn brings a lot of new hand categories for the big blind, we think we should decrease the sizing because the big blind's just going to have too many strong hands in his range, and if we bet big, we're not putting his range in a tough spot. So, what I think would be good now is to set up a drill for the last part of our study session and really just drill some turn spots and see if we can nail quite a lot of the sizings it wants to use. So let's set up a drill. What do we want in our drill? Well, we're going to want to create a new one. We're going to want it to be heads up, right? And we was doing 16 big blinds, like this. Yep. Okay, and we had the small blind calling and the big blind checking back. We wanted our limp pots. Are we bothered about the flop? Not really. To test what we wanted to test, it can be pretty much any flop. We want the big blind to check, and we wanted a C bet and a call. And then we wanted a random turn, right? And we wanted to see if we could nail the turn 2 barrel sizings when it did bet. Okay, so this is going to give us this opportunity as long as we put the big blind to check, and it's going to give us our barrel opportunity. Okay, we can do this, and we can call it turn 2 barrel opportunity, heads up, limp pot, 16B effective, right? Something like this. Okay, and we've got our spot here, and we can now start our drill. Okay, and we can start our training. And we're going to be able to drill some spots. So this time we had a paired turn. We noticed that usually on paired turns we didn't really, and I think we can stick with just the sizings here. I don't think we need the exact sizings, just betting either medium, large, overbet or check is going to be good for what we want to do here. And for this I don't really want the RNG one on, so I can disable this here. Okay, so if I do bet this hand, do I think I'd bet it big? Not really, I don't think it makes too much sense. Do I think this is a good hand to barrel? I think it's a hand that's pretty close actually. I think blocking backdoor hearts is not particularly fantastic for wanting to barrel. Having the spade, we can represent some flushes on future streets. Do we fold a lot of better hands? Well, if we bet small, we're not going to fold too many king highs, and we're going to make jacks a bit indifferent. So I think this is a hand that in general could check. And we see this is the sizing it wants to take. In general with the double clicks there. Okay. If we wanted to see this, we see, look, it wants to check 93% of the time. And if it did bet, not betting too huge in general, just mainly checking, seems good. Okay, what do we have here? We have a 3. What do we notice about the 3 here? Well, it completes a lot of flop draws, right? Going to be a good turn for the big blind's range. It's going to have all the opened up 2 pairs. So we're not going to want to bet pot or bigger here. If we bet, we're going to want to bet more of about a 3/4 size in here. What properties does a hand have? It has an overcard and it has a gut shot. Can this hand bet call? No, right? If we bet, we're going to have to fold to a raise. So I think this is a hand that could definitely consider to check a decent amount of time and take its draw equity. I'm going to check, and we see that is the option it likes to take. It just doesn't want to get pushed off its equity. Okay, this time we've got paired again, and we've got clear value with our king. It seems like a hand that would make sense to extract value with. If we want to check some kings back, would we want it to be king 7? I don't think so. I think this is just happy to try and get stacks in. We don't want to bet too huge in general. However, the top card did pair, which does favour the small blind a lot. So actually betting reasonably big makes quite a bit of sense. I think bet large would be fine here, or medium. And we see bet large, so 3/4 is the most common sizing. Cool. Okay, we had a paired flop, and this turn is completely blank, right? It doesn't give the big blind any particular advantage. He's not going to have a lot of 3s. His 4s haven't improved, and none of his high card backdoors have improved. 5s is quite a nice hand here, but 5s really wants protection, right? So I think barreling would make a lot of sense here, and I think, again, around a 3/4-ish size to a large size would make sense. And we see this is the most common size again. Cool. Okay, next one, ace, king, queen, 9. So we've got value here, that's clear. When a player calls us on this flop, his range is going to be pretty strong, right? We've filtered out all the 2 low cards. So what's he going to be left with? Well, he could have called with some jack x, 10x gut shots. Okay, but he's going to have a lot of king x, he's going to have a lot of queen x, and this 9x is definitely going to have king 9, queen 9. He's going to have some hands like jack 9, 10, 9, which improve, right? And he's going to have opened up some flush draws. So all in all, it's not a card that's lower than, say, a 7 that he doesn't hit much. It's a card that definitely does hit him a bit. Does it change enough for us to want to decrease size in there? I don't think so. I think we want to be going at least 3/4 here. Does overbet make sense there? I think on a 9, probably not. I think it's a card we probably want to just go for about 3 now. Okay. And I'm wrong here, so maybe this was an overbet turn and the 9 wasn't significant enough. So first learning point here on the bot, I've made an error. Let's check. I went bet 3 and it's not a fan. It does indeed want to overbet. And I guess even just by seeing it wants to overbet, it's already making me rethink my thought process. Does this 9 give the big blind all the 2 pairs? Not really, right? It can't have ace 9. A straight was still a straight, so I guess I'm just not recognised. I overestimated the 9 being good for the big blind's range here. So cool, made a mistake and we can learn from it. If I wanted to go, say I couldn't see the solution and don't think I could figure out why I made a mistake, can always reopen the study spot and take a look at the ranges and see where my thought process was going a bit wrong. So we see it is actually a spot where it does just want to bet big or check. The 9's not good enough for the big blind's defend range, this means clearly then. And yeah, I guess the ace, king, queen, the small blind smashing so much in the top range still, and let's just confirm this with the graph. And we see the small blind does indeed have a lot of hands that are quite high up on the equity graph here. Jack 10 obviously both players has, but after Jack 10 it's just the small blind has all the ace x and 2 pair of ace x's the big blind can't have. And yeah, sure, the 9 does introduce king 9, queen 9, but these are hands that are going to be ISO'd at a decent frequency pre-flop too. So this is where my thought process is going wrong. The 9 just wasn't quite enough to shift anything for the big blind, so we can still go for a more polarizing barrel strategy. So a nice little mistake there that we've rectified in my thought process. Okay, continuing. We had a monotone flop. Very, very reasonably rare. Happened like less than 1 in 10 times. What do we notice about this hand? Well, I think this is a good turn for the big blind. Definitely. This completes straights, gives 2 pairs. So I think definitely a turn that we have to be a little bit careful on. I think that we'd prefer to barrel hands with pair plus spade. I don't think we'd want to barrel a hand like 10-9 of diamonds ever here pretty much. But I think this hand definitely comfortable to go for it. And I think this is a board where 3/4 would be the max on the turn. And I could even see sometimes a half pot barrel. So I'd say half pot to 3/4 here. So medium or large. Let's go for medium. And we see it's reasonably happy with that. Let's just double check here. I'm presuming it's either small, medium or large. So like about 2 to 3 big blinds would be what I was thinking there. And we can see, yep, 3 big blinds is the main sizing. So yep, and one thing I really thought there was we don't really want to be barreling with anything weaker than a pair plus draw. And that's actually something I'd like to just check that I'm thinking along the right line. So I would open up study here and I'd check that I am thinking along the right lines there. If we go to what we want to barrel, and let's just take our top pair for example, what do we notice about them? Ace 9, okay, it is barreling without a spade here, but not as often. King 9, it's already checking nearly always without the spade, right? Queen 9, it's almost always checking without the spade. Jack 9, so yeah, it's really clearly preferring to have the spade if possible here. If we take a look at some of the weaker kickers that are betting, we notice it's basically always with the spade as well. So it seems like that thought process was along the right lines. So that's cool, I can close that tab now and feel confident that my thought process is at least pretty accurate there. Okay, let's take a look at 3 more. Okay, so ace 5. This 6 hasn't changed anything. Sure, it's opened up a flush draw, but I think this is a turn where our value's still really happy. I think this is one where like a 4.5 big blind bet would make a lot of sense. And we see, yep, that is I went over bet, it chose 6, that's the most common sizing. Again, if we want to double check, we see, yeah, always 6 or 4.5, so good, we're along the right lines. Okay. Got an 8 turn here. What did the 8 change? Well, it's not improved the big blind significantly at all. All the gut shots have not improved. Sure, a few hands with backdoors hit the 8, but not much. So this is a turn we're going to feel comfortable to bet decent on. I think the main sizing here is going to be around 4.5 big blinds. Maybe I can even change the input here so we get our choice of which one we want to pick again. So I think, yeah, I think definitely at least 3, and I think 4.5 would make a decent chunk of sense. It'd start to pressure this 5 and 3 region. Do I want to bet with this specific hand though, or do I want to check it? Well, I think I'm going to want to check a lot of hands like Jack 7 I've turned, but I think 7-6 has so much equity that it's actually going to be fine to have this hand sometimes as a bet and give up. But would I rather check 7-6 and take hands like Jack 9 of spades and Queen Jack of spades? Jack 9, for example, could easily call a jam. 7-6 is struggling a little bit more, but I think it's going to be pretty close. I think this was going to be like the borderline hand, so I'll give it the 4.5. Okay, probably wanted to check it then. So this is again somewhere I would load it up. And we see, okay, it wants to check. Oh, it wants to just go 3 as its main sizing. Okay, so it's not quite going into the overbet territory. Let's double check. Again, I think there's some stuff we can learn here. Was I right in the gut shot region, not wanting to barrel too much? Would rather choose really high equity draws or low equity hands, so let's check that. We see, so I was right, but it is happy to start to incorporate some overbetting. That's cool. I went at least going to want to go 3 big blinds, so I'm accurate with that. Cool. I said I think 7-6 is about the cutoff point for the equity of the hand wanting to have. And I said if I had a hand like Jack 9 suited or Queen 9 suited, I might feel a bit more confident to bet it a bit more often. So let's check. Let's go to our flush draws, our combo draws. And we see, yeah, look, if we have Queen 9, it's happy to always take it. If we have one of our Jack X ones, it's happy to pretty much always take it. And with some of our lower ones, it starts to check them a little bit more often. And I think this is just because it's a little bit more scared to face a raise, but it seems a combo draw's got enough anyway. But there is another part of our draws I want to check, and that's the gut shots. And we see the gut shots in general prefer to check over betting. And it's going to take the ones with the spade here to overbet sometimes and check the ones without. This is just because it's going to block some combo draws when it has the spade combo. So it's going to block some jams from the opponent, so it'd rather take these ones. But again, we notice in the trend that it prefers to check more than it likes to bet with its draws. This is a trend we noticed throughout our study session, right? And if we go to our no-made hands, again, it's going to look to have these polarizing bluffs quite a lot. These Jack 2, these Jack 4, these Queen 2, for example, Queen 6, Queen 7. So yeah, I think we've checked the turns, we've checked completed compared to non-completed. We've learned that when the turn is a really blank card, not improving the big blind's range much, we're more comfortable to bet bigger with our value, and so quote-unquote hands that seem thinner, so top pair with nothing else to go with it, just because on that board they maintain much higher equity. And we've seen that when the turn brings some kind of equity change in turn, so when it completes a lot of straights, or it completes straights and flushes, or it pairs, then we're going to want to decrease that barrel frequency and even the size, just because the big blind has too many hands it can continue with versus our aggression. So, hopefully you found this video enjoyable, and hopefully you've learned something. And if you have liked this video and want to get yourself a GTO Wizard subscription, you can get 10% off your first purchase by clicking the link in the description. This helps us to keep these videos for free. You can also find the link on our homepage at r&bpoker.com or on our Discord server. Thanks for watching and good luck on the tables, guys, and see you in the next video.